what we're concerned about, what we want to protect can be different for every customer, right?
Sure.
By vertical, it can be different, and in fact, compliance requirements can drive that by vertical, PCI versus HIPAA versus SCADA or what have you. Now, with that said, the tools, the technology tools that we use don't really vary that much across the verticals. So, yes and no.
Okay. And how about evolving threats? Because security is very much front of mind. How have you seen the threats evolve, during the time you've been focusing on this?
So that's a very good question. Maybe 10, 15 years, or we'll kind of separate it between older and maybe past 2 years, but it's a very good question because it gets right to the heart of what we need to do in order to protect ourselves. I was thinking about a goofy analogy, but we're in Canada and the national bird is what? It's the mosquito, correct? Well, it turns out St. Louis has its fair share of those as well, and yeah, they're big enough to carry you away. But you would never take ibuprofen to keep mosquitoes away, right? There's different solutions for that. And so it gets really to the heart of what you need to focus on in order to really protect yourself. And so an analogy might be, if the attack is coming from lateral movement past the firewall, throwing more firewalls at it is not going to help us. So that's really the kind of big change that we see. A couple of things. There's more and more information that's being digitized. And needless to say, the value of that information is growing. And so, the advantage of stealing it, as well as the risk associated to an organization, is growing. And then add to that the fact that I almost have ubiquitous access to it. From any device, anywhere, I can gain access to this, and access to data kind of equates to access to hacking as well. And so, it's the combination of those two. The big difference, though, is that where it was very opportunistic in the past, maybe a virus, and partly it's just that the industry is doing a better job on that side. It's really much more targeted these days. It's basically premeditated. Many of them start with theft of a user's credentials, and basically once a legitimate, if you will, connection is established in the network, they're moving laterally from there to assets of greater and greater value. So it's not as much about sitting on the perimeter as it is pushing that segmentation back into your network appropriately.
Are there any examples that you could give? Or?
Yeah, actually we could talk about a few. One, without mentioning their name, has been taken through the woods, so to speak, through the ringer by everyone, and actually that's not such a bad thing. It's helped us to understand this. And, just to throw out a bunch of names, whether you talk about Sony or Home Depot or Target or JP Morgan or name one, all of those started with really credential theft and then gaining access. Because what does a VPN do? Essentially, it attaches a trusted device to a trusted network. Well, what happens when those credentials are stolen and that person on that device is no longer trusted? And then they can apply every tool at their disposal for port scanning or VLAN surfing or what have you to determine the holes in the back end of the network. So, basically, it was the example of an HVAC partner who was supposed to have access to billing and to invoicing to facilitate the process. I mean, that's why we would extend that. His credentials were stolen through a phishing campaign. They were used to establish a rogue VPN. From there, the attacker was able to move laterally within the back of the network to actually install malware on the POS server to collect credit card information, as well as to move laterally to a separate server where they installed exfiltration software, data collection over to exfiltration and out. And the interesting thing here, again, as you look at that kind of analogy on ibuprofen for mosquitoes, intrusion detection, what we find is that it's seconds or minutes to infection. It's days, weeks, or months to detection and mitigation. And that gap in between is our problem. And we can focus on moving that gap further and further back, but the real key is really to focus more on containment by implementing the appropriate segmentation.
So we talk a lot about connected devices, and a lot of the themes that we've seen here at SOTI Sync have also been about mega data and data of things. What about with the adoption of wearables, for example, and the vision into things like the connected car or the driverless car? Do you feel that things are becoming more secure or less secure, or that the focus is simply shifted?
Well, I guess the way I would summarize that is I expect that there eventually will be greater security, but there's going to be darkness before we see the light. And I'll give you an example. I mean, let's talk about IoT, right? We're talking about a device that has compute as well as connectivity capabilities. It's really made up of hundreds or maybe thousands of sensors. It's really not something I can update, and there's rarely any security behind it. So maybe it's a specialized device that's supposed to do nothing more than weigh and print a price label. So it should have access to pricing. Without the appropriate segmentation around that, you get into cross-pollination of attacks. And actually, I can give a very specific example of that. After that large U.S. retailer was breached, they commissioned Verizon to do some penetration testing. And at one of the stores, they basically were able to, from an olive station that was back in the deli area, where essentially you would go and get any kind of olive salad, throw it in the cup, you would stick it on the weigh station there, and essentially it was connected to the pricing. It would print a label, and you could self-check out then instead of having to go through lines with the people. Well, in the penetration testing, they were able to establish a connection actually to the cash registers from that IoT device. So if we don't, all it should have had access to was pricing information, a table of pricing information. Unfortunately, without that segmentation, you're able to move laterally and trouble occurs. So.
Well, maybe to summarize just what we've been talking about, if there were 3 pieces of advice you could give our audience here today, what would it be?
Okay, so I think I would start with embrace the concept of software-defined security. And what I mean by that is security that is completely business-focused and completely decoupled from the infrastructure. The way we like to say it, let a route, let a switch. Security isn't too important to be a hobby. So that would be number 1. Number 2, I'd say, is maybe adopt an IT security architecture that enforces zero trust. And what I mean by that is that no network, no user, no device, no application can be completely trusted, and implementing the appropriate solution to do that. And then I think the third would be prioritize breach containment as highly or higher than breach detection. As I said, the time to infection can be quite small, the time to detection and mitigation can be longer, and so the key is how do we contain them to that which they should be able to access, and only that which they should be able to access if I'm breached. Most of the industry analysts are telling us to assume that you already are, that they're already in, and that they're getting ready to exfiltrate, which is kind of a scary concept, but so breach containment.
That's great, thanks. Well, great insights, Chris. Thank you very much.
Yes.
Just have a hand for our guests here.